taking a closer look with Preacher Nello.
Hello, greetings. So I have an interesting presentation for you. Those of you who know me know that I love numbers. I love to think of numbers. And I deal with numbers in my teaching career as well. And I went on a quest to look at the ages, to trace the ages of the patriarchs from Abraham right down to Joseph. And I found some things quite interesting. One of the things that it helped me to realize so that the chapters or the stories that are given in Genesis are not always written in chronological order. And you will see that in a little while. And you will also realize that in our concepts, in our minds, we would have put certain ages on these men and women as the stories progressed, using our age, our culture, our times, our culture, and not realize that the ages of these men and women were quite different from what we probably would have been thinking about. And so I'm going to be looking at a number of them and you know what I'd encourage you to do? Get your Bibles and get your pen or your pencils, and maybe you could mark them in your Bibles. So as I go along, you could pause the video, look for those passages that I give, and put the ages of the persons that I mentioned there. So the next time you are reading those stories or you refer to them, you can have an idea of how old these persons were at the time of any particular event. So without any further ado, let's jump right into it. So we are looking at the ages of the patriarchs and the matriarchs of Israel from Abram to Joseph or Joseph. And we begin with Abram. So Abram, Genesis 12, verse 4, departed as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 70 and 5 years old when he departed out of Haran. Now, let me pause to say this. In some of the cases, the ages are given. In some cases, I had to work them out. For some, I had to do back calculations and work them out. So I will mention certain ages, but you will not see that directly in the scriptures. It meant that I would have had to do some calculations going forwards and backwards and matching stories to be able to come up with these ages. But some of them are clearly stated, like Abraham being 75 years old. Now, according to Genesis chapter 17 and verse 17, we realize that Sarah would have been 10 years younger than Abraham when God called him. So while he was 75, she was 65 years old. And at that time, apparently, women were still of childbearing age, given that they lived many years. Remember that these men and women lived Methuselah lived till he was at 996. And many of these patriarchs, they lived to 600 and odd, 700 and odd, and so on. So 75 and 76 were pretty still young people. Still, well, what we would probably call today middle agers, right? And no mention of her being old here. Let's jump quickly to what Genesis 17, verse 17 says. Genesis 17:17, that Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old, and Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? So Genesis 17:17 made me realize that Sarah was 10 years rather, Abraham's junior. Genesis 18:11, now Abraham or Abraham and Sarah were old. Listen what they call old, and advanced in years. The way of woman had ceased to be with her. What does it mean by the way of woman? It means her menstrual cycle had stopped by this time. Now, by this time, Sarah would have been past 90, according to this text. Look at verse 11, sorry, Hebrews 11, verses 10 to 11. He says that even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead. So at this point, they were now considered old, 100 years old and 90 years old. But prior to that, they were not called old. And in fact, Sarah, they did not say that the manner of woman had ceased yet. All right. So she was still able, she was still at childbearing age when she was called, when Abraham or Abram was called. All right. Okay. Let's go to the next marker. Genesis 16:3. So after Abraham lived 10 years in the land of Canaan or Canaan, Sarai, Abraham's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abraham or Abram, her husband, as a wife. So remember, he left Haran. He left Haran when he was, or the land of Uz, when he was 75. Sarah was 65. 10 years into Canaan, he was now 85 and she was 75. All right, so Abraham had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan. In Genesis 16:16, the Bible says Abraham was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abraham. All right, how old was he? 86. All right, this means Sarai was 76 at the time. When God again called Abraham to remembrance of the promise that he had made to him in Genesis 17, verse 1, which reads, when Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abraham and said to him, I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless. So Abraham and Sarah's names were changed by this time to Abraham and Sarah. Genesis 17, verses 5 and 15. When the angel visited, Abraham laughed at the proposal of children. He was now 99. And if the angel said next year, this time, that means he was supposed to be 100 and Sarah would be 90. And that's why Abraham laughed and said, how is that going to be possible? So at age 99 years old, this would have been 13 years after Ishmael's birth. Remember, he got Ishmael when he was 86. So 13 years later, the angel came and visited him and said this to him. Yah reminded Abraham of his promise to him that was made in Genesis 17, verses 24 to 25. Fast forward to the birth of Isaac or Isaac. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age. Notice, in his old age. So he's now 100 he's now being called old at the time of which God had spoken to him. And you can compare that to verse 7. Abraham was old, or I think that should be verse 5. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. So remember now, Isaac is 100 years younger than his father. Abraham was 100. Remember, Sarah is still 10 years younger. So she's 90. Remember, Ishmael was 13 last year. This year, when Isaac is born, he's now 14. So Isaac is 14 years younger than Ishmael. Notice 14 was still considered to be a child or a boy. If you read verses 14, 16, 18, and 19, he's constantly being referred to as the boy or the child. So 14 was still considered young. And again, based on the longevity of these men and women of that time. In Genesis 22, verses 1 and 6, so, when God told Abraham to go and sacrifice his son, he says, after these things, we do not know how long after, and we do not know Isaac's age or Isaac's age. But the fact that Abraham laid the wood upon Isaac, indicates that the boy was strong enough to carry. So it would not have been a child like a 4-year-old or a 6-year-old or so. By this time, I'm assuming he would probably be in his mid-teens to mid-20s. And that, in that context, would still be considered young, right? Still be a boy. So he could have been anywhere from his teens into his 30s, into his 20s, and still be referred to as a boy. Genesis 23, verse 1. Sarah lived to be 127 years old. And these were the years of Sarah's life. So she arrived at 127 and she died. By this time, Abraham was 137. Ishmael was 51. And Isaac was 37. Now, let me interject something here. Abraham was 137 years old. How many of you knew that after Sarah died, he married a second wife, Keturah, and had children with her, several children too? Interesting. Genesis 24, we get to Genesis 24, which speaks of the marriage between Isaac or Isaac and Rebekah. Now, Abraham was old, well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. By this time, Abraham being old and advanced in years was 140. Isaac married Rebekah when he was 40 years old. According to Genesis 25, verse 20, he was 40 years old. By this time, remember, Ishmael is 14 years his senior. So Ishmael is now 54. Genesis 24, verse 67 indicates some things here. That when he got married, when Isaac got married, this is after his mother's death. When Isaac got married, he was comforted, right, by having his new wife. And this was 3 years after his mother's death. So after Sarah died, 3 years later was when Isaac got married to Rebekah. Now let's jump down to Genesis 25, verses 7 and 8. It says, these are the days of the years of Abraham's life, 175 years. So Abraham lived as much as 175 years. He breathed his last in a good old age, an old man and full of years. At 175, remember, his predecessors lived to 900 and odd, 600 and odd, 700 and odd, and so on. But by this time, apparently, the age limit had been reduced significantly. So Abram was considered old and full of years at 175. By this time, when Abram died, Ishmael was 86. Isaac would have been 75. Isaac had Esau and Jacob when he was 60 years old. Genesis 25, verse 26. Let's check on that. Genesis 25:26. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob or Yaakov. Isaac was 60 years old when he bore them. All right. So when she bore them, remember, he got married at 40. And remember, his wife was barren for a while and he had to intercede to the Lord. So he interceded with the Lord for approximately 20 years before Rebekah actually conceived. These are the generation of Ishmael. Now, what I want to realize, as I said before, and I'm repeating, that the stories, and this is what I discovered when I was looking at the ages, the stories flip back and forward, backwards and forward. So what the writer did was to give some synopsis about Abraham's life. Then he went back and gave Isaac's life. And he went back and he gave Ishmael's life. And he went back and he gave Jacob's life. And he went back and he gave Joseph's life. So you are going to, and Esau as well. He went back at some point. And so you will see, for example, one chapter following the other, but it is a flip back. Just for argument's sake, Genesis 26 following 25 doesn't necessarily mean the story follow in that order. The writer may have gone back in time to pick up with one of the patriarchs and dealt with their generation and their age. So, for example, here we see Genesis 25, verses 12 to 17. he gives Ishmael's generation. Ishmael, Abraham's son, that he bore with Hagar, right? And he lists out all the children, all the sons of Ishmael, right? And in verse 17, it says, these are the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years old, and he breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people. So Ishmael lived as long as 170, 120, 37 years old. So let's go back to Genesis 25 now, verses 7 and 8. It means if you do the calculations right, you will notice, let's go again. Abraham died at 175. Ishmael would have been 86. Isaac would have been 75. Esau and Jacob, he got them when he was 60 years old. That's 15 years before. 15 years before. Which means when Esau and Jacob were born, Abraham was still alive because he died 15 years later. You see that? Even though no mention is made of Abraham in the story surrounding Isaac, Esau, and Jacob, no mention is made of Abraham. But based on the calculation of when they died, you will realize that Abraham was still around, but the story was not focusing on Abraham. It was focusing on Isaac, Esau, and Jacob, right? So Abraham saw his two grandchildren by Isaac, and he also saw other grandchildren by Ishmael, based on Genesis 25, verses 12 to 18. Yes? So Ishmael died at 137. By this time, Isaac would have been 123 years old. Esau and Jacob were now 63. 63. Isaac, remember, Isaac got them when he was 60, right? Okay. Let's go back. So again, the story goes back to Esau. You see, Genesis 26 goes back to Esau. When Esau was 40 years old, he took Judith, the daughter of Beeri, the Hittite, to be his wife, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon, the Hittite. So at age 40, Esau took wives that grieved his parents. Esau, by then, would have been 100 years old. Both Esau and Jacob, obviously, would have been 100 years old, since he is 60 years senior to his son. I think that should be Isaac, not Esau. Let me correct that. That should be Isaac. So Isaac would have been 100 years old. When Esau got married, Isaac was 100 years old. Because remember, he was 60 years senior to his sons. So Genesis 27, verse 1 picks up by saying, when Isaac was old, his eyes were dim so that he could not see. He called Esau his brother, his older son rather, and said to him, my son. And he answered, here am I. All right, let's work this out now. Although the age of Isaac was not mentioned, based on where we are in the story and based on my calculation, I figured a broad range. Isaac would have been more than 100 years old by this time. He could have been anywhere between 100 and 150. All right? And yes, so he would have been anywhere there. His sons were now over 40, anywhere between 40 and 90. I know it's a broad range, but I had to make it as broad as that. So based on the ages that are given in the stories. But we're going to narrate down some more. Don't worry yourself. Genesis 28, verse 5. Thus Isaac sent Jacob away, and he went to Aram, to Laban, the son of Bethuel, the Aramean, the brother of Rebekah, Jacob's and Esau's mother. Now, again, when I did my back calculations, I am proposing that Jacob was 71 years old when he ran away from home. And know in our minds, when we think about it, we are thinking, okay, these are two young men, teenagers, maybe 20-year-olds, maybe possibly 30. These were men 70 odd year old, right? Jacob was 71 years old when as I said, based on my backward calculation. So I went forward into later years and calculated the years going backwards. And let me tell you, one of the things that I use is that Jacob spent 20 years away from home. 20 years. Or he was laboring, he was working with Laban for 20 years. All right. So when Jacob um left home, he was 71, about 71. That's my um calculations. It means that Isaac would have been 131 years old at the time. Genesis 29, verse 21 tells us Jacob said to Laban or Laban, give me my wife that I may go into her, for my time is completed. Remember when he met Rachel and he met her father Laban, he said, I like your daughter. I want to marry your daughter. And he said, well, you have to go work. You have to go pay me wages. I don't have no money to pay, but I can work for you for 7 years, which he did. So at the time, Jacob would have been about 78 years old when he completed that 7 years. So he would have worked for 7 years for Rachel, but got Leah instead. By this time, Isaac was 138 years old. Isaac wasn't yet dead. Isaac was still back home in Canaan. Verse 30 tells us, so Jacob went into Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah, and served Laban another 7 years. So that's 14 years. Jacob worked another 7 years for Rachel, right? So he would have been 85 years old. And just to backtrack a little bit, I would have done some studies on this before. If you missed those, you can go back and watch those videos. But initially, I thought that Jacob got Rachel after the 14 year, but no. He worked 7 years for Rachel, got Leah. They spent 7 days celebrating the wedding, and at the end of the 7 days, he got Rachel also, but he still had to work 14 years to pay off for getting Rachel. All right. At the end of that 7 years, he would now be 85. Jacob is not a baby, not a young boy. Right? And Isaac, still alive, would have been 145 years old. Genesis 30, verses 22 to 24 tells us this. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. He conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph or Joseph. May the Lord add to me another son. When Joseph was born, Jacob was 91 years old. 91 years old. And Isaac is now 151. And so Jacob being 91 years old, the Bible said he had him in his old age. Now the days of Isaac was 180 years. So he lived for 180 years. So remember, go back to this, Isaac being 151, he was still alive in the land of Canaan. Now the days of Isaac were 180 years old. So Isaac lived until he was 180. It's a long time after when he claimed that he was going to die in verse 20, in Genesis 27. Esau and Jacob would have now been 120. Joseph was now 29 at this time, almost governor of Egypt. Remember, Joseph went down into Egypt when he was 17. By this time, he was now 29. So between 17 years old and 29, that's when 12 years, he would have gone into a pit, gone into Potiphar's house, gone to prison, and was soon to be out of prison. Genesis 35, 2 to 3. These are the generations of Jacob. So notice the writer goes back to Jacob. So he picks out Abraham, talks about Abraham. He picks out Isaac, talks about Isaac. He picks out Ishmael, he talks about Ishmael. He picks out Esau, he talks about Esau. And he's now coming back to Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a robe of many colors. Go back. Let's go back. When Joseph was born, Jacob was 91 years old, son of his old age. By the time Joseph got to 17, Jacob was now 108 years old. Isaac was still alive, 168 years old. Right? And Isaac died 12 years later at age 180. So all of the stories that was happening with Joseph and his brothers, Isaac was still alive, but no mention is made of him because the story was now focusing on Jacob and Joseph and his brothers. When Joseph became prime minister of Egypt, he was 30, right? According to Genesis 41, verse 46. Jacob would have been 121 years old at the time. Then you remember that he told Pharaoh that there were going to be 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine, right? So after the 7 years of famine, it was after the 7 years of plenty, then the famine began. So at the end of the 7 years of plenty, Joseph would have been 37 years old. Remember, he took up office when he was 30, and there were 7 years of plenty. Joseph was 37. Jacob was now 128. Chapter 45, verse 6. When the brothers came down to Egypt to get grain, 2 years had lapsed into the famine. All right, 2 years would have been lapsed. So remember, Joseph was 30 when he took up office, 7 years of plenty, and now 2 years of famine had already gone when his brothers came. 7 plus 2, that's 9. Joseph is now 39 years old, and Jacob is 130 years old. Genesis 46, verses 7 and 9. His sons, Jacob's sons, and his sons' sons went down to Egypt with him, right? And when he got to Egypt, he was 130 years old. So Jacob arrived in Egypt when he was 130 years old. I was looking for the passage where Pharaoh asked him how old he was. And he said, my days have been few and miserable compared to my fathers. And he was saying, compared to my ancestors, like the Noahs and the Enochs and the Methuselahs, who lived to hundreds of years. I'm just living 130 years since I was born. Nothing compared to my fathers. Joseph was now 39, and Joseph had now stayed 17 years in Egypt. Sorry, Jacob stayed 17 years in Egypt and died at 147 years old. So he got there when he was 30, and the Bible said he died at 147. Right? And here it is, Genesis 47, verse 28. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147. All right. By this time, Joseph was 56 years old. Genesis 50, verses 22 and 26. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years old, which is even younger than the others. So Joseph died being 110 years old. They embalmed him and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Right? So he spent all of 93 from age 17 to 110. He spent all of 93 years old. 93 years rather in Egypt. In other words, Joseph spent, you could say literally he spent all his life. He, literally became an Egyptian. All right. So I hope that little presentation would have helped you to realize some things, that the ages at which we think these patriarchs were when the stories are written about them, they were not those kind of age. They were big men and big women. Right? I hope it also may help you to realize that some of the struggles that they went through were not while they were young people. So it would have been even more challenging for them. And thirdly, I hope it helps you to realize that the stories are not always following chapter by chapter chronologically. Sometimes the writer goes back to deal with a particular character. And it is good to know what age that character was. So you can put the stories in perspective. You realize, as I said before, that even though Abraham was not mentioned, he was still around when Esau and Jacob were born. Right? Likewise, Isaac was around when Jacob and Esau started having children. Right? And the rivalry between the two were not while they were young teenagers or even early 20s. They were well advanced as big men in their years. Right? I hope you enjoyed this presentation as much as I did. Take care and walk.
Subscribe on YouTube.